Summer, 480 BCE. The Aegean Sea trembles beneath the march of an empire. From the cliffs above Sparta, the horizon burns red with the reflection of countless torches, a fiery line snaking across the distant waters, where the armies of Xerxes, king of kings, advance like a tide of bronze and shadow. The wind carries the scent of salt and fear, whispering through olive groves and across the Peloponnesian hills. News travels fast in Greece. Scouts from the north speak of bridges of boats crossing the Hellespont, of entire forests cut down to build rafts strong enough to carry horses and chariots. They tell of ships more than 1,000 sailing under banners stitched with the winged lion of Persia. Behind them, a land army of nearly 2 million souls. Never before had mankind seen such a force, and yet, within the walled city of Sparta, silence reigns. The men sharpen their spears in the fading light, the sound of whetstone against bronze echoing like distant thunder. No one speaks of fear. To be Spartan is to know that life belongs to the state, and death, if it comes in battle, is an honor. At the heart of this stillness stands King Leonidas, broad-shouldered and solemn, his beard streaked with gray, his gaze fixed on the northern road. The Ephors Sparta's priestly elders had warned him that the Carnea festival forbade war. The gods must be honored before battle, but Leonidas knows time is against them. If Xerxes breaks through the mountain passes, all Greece will burn before the festival's end. He turns to his commanders. "We march at dawn," he says, 300 of our best fathers, not sons, warriors who leave heirs behind. We go not to return, but to buy time for Greece." His words settle like iron. The men nod, each understanding the weight of the choice. These will not be the youngest nor the swiftest of Sparta's sons, but its most resolute. As the sun sinks behind Taygetus, Sparta's streets fill with the low hum of preparation. Women bring out shields polished to mirror brightness. Mothers embrace their sons, pressing foreheads to bronze. One woman grips her child's arm and whispers the ancient farewell. "Return with your shield or upon it." That night, the campfires of Sparta burn with quiet intensity. Leonidas walks among his men, saying little. He knows what awaits them, a death that will echo beyond lifetimes. But for now, there is peace. The stars above shimmer cold and clear, reflected in the polished tips of their spears. Far to the north, thunder rolls across the Macedonian plains. The Persian army moves like a living storm, archers, cavalry, chariots plated with gold and iron, the famed immortals in their black lamellar armor. Each step they take crushes the earth beneath sandals and hooves. Xerxes rides at the center of this colossal serpent of war, seated upon a chariot draped in purple silk. He believes himself divine, the ruler of all men, destined to erase the memory of defiance at Marathon. But he does not yet know that 300 Spartans are coming to meet him. By dawn, the warriors of Sparta gather at the city's edge. The clang of armor rises with the morning fog. Leonidas raises his spear, its tip catching the first light of day. For Sparta. For freedom. The army moves northward through the hills, their crimson cloaks streaming behind them like banners of fire. Farmers pause in their fields to watch them pass, eyes wide with awe. To see a Spartan phalanx on the march is to glimpse destiny in motion, bronze shields overlapping in perfect rhythm. Their footsteps one heartbeat, their silence louder than drums. Behind them, wives and mothers stand in a line upon the walls, faces carved in stone. They do not weep. In Sparta, tears are for the living. Days later, the 300 will reach the pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow ribbon of land between mountains and sea. There, Leonidas will make his stand, not for victory, but for memory. The storm is coming, and in its path, 300 men prepare to hold back an empire. The sun had barely risen when the mountains of central Greece came into view, jagged ridges of gray and green, slashed by mist and shadow. As Leonidas and his 300 Spartans descended through the winding valleys, the smell of the sea drifted toward them. Before long, they stood at the mouth of Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow corridor between the Kalidromos Mountains and the restless Malian Gulf. Here, the land seemed built by the gods for defense. The pass was so narrow that only a handful of men could stand abreast. On one side, cliffs plunged steeply toward the sea. On the other, sulfurous steam rose from boiling springs that hissed like serpents. The air smelled of salt and earth and fire. Leonidas gazed at it in silence. This was the place where Greece would test its fate. By the time the Spartans arrived, other Greek contingents had already begun to gather Thespians from the foothills, men of Thebes, Phocians, and a few thousand others drawn by duty and fear. Together, they numbered perhaps 7,000, a fragile thread against a sea of Persian steel. Leonidas walked the length of the pass with his captains, counting the steps between mountain and shore. "Here," he said, pointing to a narrow choke point, "we build the wall." The soldiers set to work with silent precision, stacking stones into a barrier waist-high, enough to break the Persian momentum when they came. The clang of hammers echoed through the pass, mingling with the low murmur of surf. That evening, as the sun dipped into the Aegean, Leonidas gathered his men by the fires. "This place will be our shield," he said. "Here, courage will count for more than numbers." One soldier laughed softly. "Then we are rich, my king." Laughter rippled through the Spartan ranks, brief, sharp, defiant. They ate roasted meat, drank watered wine, and spoke of home. Some polished their spears, others mended broken straps on their sandals. None doubted what was coming. The next morning, a scout from the northern ridge returned, his face pale beneath a crust of dust and sweat. He fell to one knee before Leonidas. "They're coming," he said. "The horizon is black with sails." From the cliffs above Thermopylae, the warriors could see the Persian armada gliding like a vast shadow over the gulf, hundreds upon hundreds of triremes, their bronze rams glinting in the light. And beyond them, through the haze, rose the dust of an army so vast it seemed the earth itself was moving. The Spartan soldiers stood unmoving as they watched the spectacle. Some spat into the dust, others gripped their shields tighter. Beside Leonidas, Captain Dianekes murmured, "It seems their arrows will blot out the sun." Leonidas turned to him, the faintest smile beneath his beard. "Then we shall fight in the shade." When night fell, the flicker of thousands of Persian campfires filled the distant horizon like a second sky. The ground trembled with the movement of beasts and men. The murmurs of drums rolled across the plain, steady and slow, as if time itself were marching toward the pass. In the darkness, Leonidas knelt beside the small altar they had built from mountain stone. He placed his helmet before it and offered a silent prayer, not for victory, but for remembrance. The Spartans would stand at the hot gates. And when the world looked back, it would remember what men can endure when courage is all they have left. Dawn broke like fire over the Aegean. A red light bled across the cliffs, striking the polished bronze of Spartan helmets until they glowed like embers. The sea beyond Thermopylae was calm, too calm, as if holding its breath. And then came the sound, a deep, rolling thunder that was not from the heavens, but from men. The Persian army had arrived. From the haze of morning, banners unfurled vast squares of silk bearing the Lion of Persia, the winged bull of Babylon, the crescent of the Medes. The ground shook beneath the tramp of countless feet. Cavalry horses neighed, armor clattered, and somewhere in the distance, a horn screamed across the valley. At the front of this living storm rode King Xerxes, crowned in gold, his robes glimmering like sunlight on oil. He looked upon the narrow pass and laughed. "Only this," he said, "this is what stands between me and Greece." The first wave advanced the Medes, proud warriors of the Northern Empire, armed with wicker shields and short spears. They marched in perfect rhythm toward the wall of stone and bronze that blocked the hot gates. Atop that wall, Leonidas stood unmoving, his crimson cloak stirring in the wind. Behind him, the Spartans formed their phalanx shields locked edge to edge, spears poised forward, their faces hidden beneath bronze masks that reflected the dawn like firelight. The Persian horns blared, the Medes charged. What followed was not battle, it was slaughter. The Spartans moved as one. When the first Persians crashed against their line, the sound was like thunder striking iron. Spears thrust forward with machine precision, finding throats, eyes, and hearts. Shields shoved and crushed, boots stamped and drove bodies into the dust. The narrowness of the pass turned the Persian numbers against them. There was nowhere to move, nowhere to swing freely. "Push!" Leonidas roared, and the wall of bronze surged. The Persians fell back, tripping over their own dead. The Spartans stepped forward in perfect unison, shields slamming down, forming an unbroken front once more. From his throne upon the hill, Xerxes watched in disbelief. The Medes had broken. He ordered his elite, the Immortals, 10,000 men clad in black lamellar armor, faces hidden behind silver masks. These were the pride of Persia, men said to be undefeatable. They descended upon Thermopylae with a roar, arrows darkening the sky. Yet when they reached the pass, the Spartans did not flinch. Their overlapping shields formed an iron shell. Arrows clattered harmlessly against the wall of bronze and wood. Then the phalanx moved again, slow, unstoppable, like the tide. Spears thrust through gaps, striking the unguarded bellies of the Immortals. When their spears broke, the Spartans drew their xiphos, short leaf-shaped swords, and hacked at the enemy with brutal efficiency. By midday, the ground was slick with blood and ash. The Persians withdrew, dragging their dead from the field. The mountain air was heavy with the stench of death and sulfur. Leonidas wiped his blade on a fallen cloak, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, his men stood calm, breathing slow and steady, as though they had simply trained, not fought, one of the greatest armies on earth. A messenger galloped up the slope to Xerxes' golden chariot, dust rising behind him. "My king," he gasped, "they hold the pass." Xerxes' face darkened. He could not comprehend it that 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies had defied him, that the tide of Persia had broken upon a wall of flesh and will. He turned his gaze toward Thermopylae, toward the crimson cloaks that still glimmered in the dying sun. "Crush them," he whispered. "Crush them all." But in the narrow shadows of the hot gates, the Spartans were already preparing for the next assault, their armor dented, their arms stained with blood, yet their eyes burned bright. For them, this was not a siege, it was destiny. Night draped the mountains of Thermopylae in shadow. The fires of both camps flickered across the valley, one side a disciplined line of dim Spartan embers. The other, a sprawling sea of Persian light stretching far into the horizon. Between them lay the stench of blood and the silence of the dead. Leonidas stood upon a ridge overlooking the pass, his cloak torn, his armor streaked with dust and iron. Below, his men slept where they stood, shields propped beside them, spears crossed in their hands. The night wind carried the hiss of the nearby hot springs, the gates that gave this place its name. He listened to the sound, the earth breathing through its open wounds, and wondered how many of his men would still be alive when the next dawn came. Behind him approached Leonidas, the veteran captain whose humor never left him, even in death's shadow. "My king," he said softly, "the men are asking if they'll see Sparta again." Leonidas turned, eyes unreadable in the firelight. "No," he said after a pause, "but Greece will." For a time, neither spoke. They both knew that the Persians would not retreat. Xerxes' pride was wounded, and pride demands blood. Far from their camp, deep in the wooded slopes above Thermopylae, a lone figure moved under moonlight. His name was Ephialtes, a local Greek lean, desperate, and bitter. He had come to the Persian lines not for honor, but for gold. He told them of a hidden trail, a narrow mountain path called Anopaia, that wound behind the cliffs and descended into the rear of the Spartan position. The Persians listened. The commander Hydarnes, captain of the Immortals, ordered torches to be extinguished. 2,000 elite soldiers followed Ephialtes into the forest. The trail was steep, silent, but for the rustle of armor and the crack of twigs. The air was heavy with pine and fear. Ephialtes walked ahead, glancing back now and then, his heart pounding. He imagined the gold waiting for him, imagined himself safe, powerful. He never realized he had just sold his name to history's eternal curse. At the top of the ridge, a small band of Phocian sentries guarded the trail. They heard the faint tread of sandaled feet long before the Immortals emerged. One of them, startled from sleep, saw the glimmer of bronze through the trees and shouted in alarm. For a heartbeat, the forest erupted, spears thrust, shields clanged, men shouted in confusion. But they were few, and the Immortals were many. When the Phocians saw the black armor and silver masks of the Persians, they realized the truth. The enemy had found the path. At dawn, a runner burst into Leonidas' camp, dust and sweat streaming down his face. "My king," he gasped. "They've come through the mountains. The Persians are at our rear." For a moment, the Spartan camp fell utterly silent. The sound of waves and crackling fire seemed to vanish. Leonidas stood motionless, then nodded once slow and calm. "So," he said, "the gods have decided." He called his officers to him, Thespians, Thebans, Spartans, and told them the truth. The pass was lost. The Persians would soon surround them. "Go," he ordered the allied Greeks. "Return home. Tell them what you saw here and what we did." Many departed, carrying grief heavier than their shields. But 700 Thespians chose to remain, as did 400 Thebans who had no choice but to obey. When Leonidas turned back toward his 300, they were already tightening their armor, readying their weapons, faces calm and unflinching. They needed no words, they knew. The king looked upon them, fathers, brothers, warriors, whose names would soon be carved into stone, and said quietly, "Eat well, men of Sparta, for tonight we dine in Hades." As the sun climbed over the mountains, the shadow of betrayal lengthened. The Persians were closing in from both sides. The narrow pass that had protected Greece now became a trap. The hot gates would soon live up to their name, not as a barrier of defense, but as a furnace of sacrifice. The morning air was thick with the scent of ash and brine. The first rays of sunlight cut through the fog that clung to the cliffs, turning the Persian ranks into a shimmering ocean of steel. From the mountain trail behind Thermopylae, a dull roar echoed. The Immortals were descending. The Spartans were surrounded. Leonidas stood at the center of the pass, his crimson cloak torn and blackened with soot, his helmet tucked beneath one arm. He watched as the last of the allied troops withdrew to safety. Then, slowly, he placed his helmet back upon his head and lowered his spear. "This is where we make our graves," he said. A low murmur rippled through the Spartan lines, not of fear, but of resolve. Around him, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and a handful of Thebans formed ranks one last time. Their shields, dented and bloodied from the previous days, locked once more in perfect alignment. The hot gates trembled under their feet as the Persian drums began to thunder. Down the slope came wave after wave of Persians' men from every corner of the empire. Babylonians with curved blades, Indians bearing long bows, Scythian horsemen dismounted to fight on foot. Xerxes had ordered no prisoners. This was to be an annihilation. The Spartans met them head on. The clash of bronze and iron filled the pass like the breaking of 1,000 storms. Spears shattered against shields. Men screamed as they were crushed beneath the weight of their comrades. Yet the phalanx did not yield. For every Spartan who fell, another stepped forward to close the line. At one point, Leonidas himself broke through the press of bodies, his spear driving into the chest of a Persian commander. Blood sprayed across his armor, and he let out a cry that echoed from the cliffs, half fury, half triumph. The men around him roared in answer. From his distant throne, Xerxes watched in disbelief. Again and again, his generals hurled men into the narrow throat of Thermopylae, and again, they broke upon it like waves on stone. By midday, the Spartan spears were splintered, their shields cracked, their arms heavy. They fought now with swords, with daggers, with bare hands. The Thespians fought beside them, refusing to flee. Together, they formed a circle of bronze and flesh, their backs against the wall of rock facing the tide. An arrow struck Leonidas' shoulder, another his thigh. Still he fought, his voice rising over the din. "Stand your ground, for Sparta, for Greece!" Then came the immortals, 10,000 black-armored soldiers descending the path Ephialtes had revealed. The Spartans turned to face them. There was no panic, only grim acceptance. Leonidas pulled the arrow from his leg, tossed aside his broken spear, and drew his short sword. When he charged, his men followed without hesitation. They crashed into the immortals with the fury of lions cornered by hunters. Bronze met iron, the clang ringing through the gorge like the toll of divine judgment. Leonidas cut down 3 men before a javelin found his chest. He stumbled, fell to one knee, but rose again, roaring as he drove his sword through the throat of another foe. Finally, struck by a storm of arrows, he fell face to the earth he had sworn to defend. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then, as if seized by madness or glory, the Spartans formed around his fallen body, fighting to protect their king's corpse. The Thespians joined them, refusing to yield even as fire rained from above. The mountains shook with the fury of men who no longer fought for life, but for memory. When the last Spartan was cut down, the pass fell silent. Smoke drifted over the broken stones. Bodies lay stacked like offerings to forgotten gods. From his chariot, Xerxes looked down upon the field and ordered that Leonidas' head be severed and his body displayed a warning to all who defied the empire. But even he, in that moment, could feel it. Something eternal had been born in the ashes. Thermopylae had fallen, but its defenders had carved their names into eternity. The battlefield lay silent under the weight of dawn. Smoke rose in slow gray tendrils from pyres of broken shields and scorched armor. The cries of the dying had faded into the hiss of the sea, and where the ground had been trampled into mud, now only the crimson of spilled blood remained. Among the wreckage stood the body of Leonidas, mutilated and displayed upon a Persian spear. His once crimson cloak fluttered faintly in the morning breeze, now the color of dried rust. Xerxes looked upon him from his golden throne and felt no triumph. The pass was his, the Spartans were dead, and yet the silence around him felt heavier than victory. No cheers came from the Persian ranks, only exhaustion and something else awe. Days later, when the Persian army marched south, they left Thermopylae behind like a scar upon the land. But the story of what had happened there did not die with the men who fought. Survivors from the allied Greek forces carried the tale across the Aegean. That 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and a handful of others had stood against the might of an empire, holding their ground until the last breath. Word spread like fire through the city-states of Greece. In Athens, citizens wept openly. In Corinth, the assembly rose in silent honor, and in Sparta, the mothers of the fallen stood before the temple of Athena, their faces unbowed. When asked how they could bear such loss, one woman answered simply, "Our sons obeyed their king." The stand at Thermopylae became more than a tragedy, it became a vow. Across the cities of Greece, men sharpened their blades, repaired their ships, and swore that the Persian tide would not go unanswered. Months later, as the Persian fleet filled the straits near Salamis, Greek triremes under Themistocles struck like wolves from the mist. Using cunning and courage, they shattered the invincible fleet of Xerxes upon the rocks. The empire that once seemed unstoppable began to falter. The war raged on to Plataea, to Mycale, until at last, the invaders were driven from Greece. But even in victory, the Greeks spoke not of revenge, but of remembrance. At Thermopylae, they raised a simple stone monument, set upon the very ground where the 300 fell. Upon it, carved in the ancient Doric tongue, were words that would echo through centuries. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Travelers from across the world would one day stand before that stone, soldiers, kings, poets, and feel the same chill that ran through the men who once fought there. Because Thermopylae was not about numbers or victory. It was about what men become when they choose duty over life and honor over fear. The Spartans had died to delay an empire, but in dying, they gave birth to something far greater, the idea that courage itself can defy destiny. As night falls once more over the hot gates, the wind still carries the echo of their defiance, the clash of bronze, the cry of Leonidas, the heartbeat of freedom that no army could conquer. Thermopylae is quiet now, but if you listen closely to the whispering sea and the sighing mountains, you can still hear them 300 men standing unbroken, forever holding the line.